Welcome, everyone, to Hot Science at Home. We're glad you can join us tonight. The University of Texas at Austin's Environmental Science Institute is so proud to bring you the latest and coolest advancements in science through Hot Science at Home. Please join me in welcoming tonight Amanda Little, our special guest for this evening. Welcome, Amanda. How are you tonight?
I am great, Jay. Thank you. How are you?
I think really good. And a little bit of background about Amanda. She's a writer in residence at Vanderbilt University, where she teaches investigative journalism. She has a fondness for far-flung and hard-to-stomach reporting that take her to ultra-deep oil rigs, down manholes, into sewage plants, and inside monsoon clouds. And yet you still made it here tonight. We feel lucky. So her most recent book is The Fate of Food, which we will hear about tonight. She's also written for the New York Times, Bloomberg, New Yorker, Vanity Fair, and Wired. She's appeared on shows such as Fresh Air and Morning Joe. For her writing, she's received the Rachel Carson Environment Book Award. But perhaps the most telling fact about Amanda's media impact are the 1.2 million views that her TED Talk has received, far outpacing a video about Britney Spears that was posted to YouTube at the same time. If there's anything that tells us there's hope for our civilization yet, it's these numbers you see right here. Okay, Amanda, let's get into it. There are two images you often juxtapose to illustrate the enormous challenges our world faces regarding food. It's these.
Yeah, I want to say before I jump in, thank you so much for having me. I think it's so important to convene these kinds of discussions, and I'm really grateful to be here. I am still getting over the two images juxtaposed of me and Britney Spears. I'm not sure if I can quickly jump into potatoes and cars, but I will try. Yeah, I think these are important images. The first shows mountains of potatoes in Idaho that had been left to rot in fields without any buyers last April. And that was because the restaurants and cafeterias and stadiums that typically consumed them had been closed during the pandemic. The second image shows thousands of cars, carloads of families that were outside of the San Antonio Food Bank, not far from you, without enough food to keep them from going hungry. And these were actually posted by chef Jose Andres. And he put this tagline that said, "How is it possible these two photos exist at the same time in the most prosperous and technologically advanced moment in our history?" And I think what's important here is that the potatoes and these lines of cars exposed how antiquated our supply chains are. Mm-hmm. Our food system has not been designed to adapt to major disruptions or to preempt them. And, COVID-19 was important in that it exposed some of these vulnerabilities, but it's just one of many major disruptions in our supply chain that are predicted in the years and decades ahead. And a lot of my reporting has been on environmental pressures on food producers that are much more chronic and complex than the pandemic. And they will prove to be potentially more devastating and disruptive to food producers in the years ahead. So building a resilient and sustainable food system is, in my opinion, as much as any other challenge, one that will define our progress over the next century.
So you've really gotten into this, and you've written a book, The Fate of Food, where you mention that climate change is something we can taste. What does that mean?
Yeah. Yes. Well, it goes back to 2014. I read an IPCC report, International Panel on Climate Change report, handed to me by my brother, an excerpt of it. He's a climate scientist. And the report said that by mid-century, the world may reach a threshold of global warming beyond which current agricultural practices can no longer support large human civilizations. That's a direct quote from that report. And I really had spent much of the previous 15 years focusing on the energy industry and the shift from fossil fuels into renewables. And I hadn't really taken time to understand how vulnerable agriculture is to pressures of climate change and to population growth, in fact. But I had really been thinking about the relationship between energy and climate, not so much as the relationship between food and climate, although I knew that a lot of energy is used for food production. But the more scientists I interviewed, the more I began to understand, as one scientist put it, that the single biggest threat of climate change is the collapse of food systems. And it sounded like a distant problem to me, about 6 years ago when I started really researching this. But in fact, we've begun to see the impacts, virtually everywhere. And some of them are obvious. I think the farmers in West Texas understand pretty well the increasing pressures of drought and wildfires. Californian farmers know it well too. We've seen heat and fires damage vineyards and livestock production this past summer. We've seen impacts on perishable foods like strawberry and citrus, water-intensive crops like avocados and almonds that are harder to grow in water-scarce regions. This summer, we saw the derecho storms in the Midwest wipe out soy and corn crops. And for every obvious impact, there are more subtle ones, like this image of these frozen apple blossoms at a farm that I visited in Wisconsin. Throughout my reporting, I traveled to 13 countries and 15 states to observe the changing agricultural landscape, in this country and throughout the world. As I said, from vineyards in California to citrus orchards in Florida. I went to coffee farms in Guatemala, to maize farms in Kenya, even to famine-stricken regions of Ethiopia and India. And when I was, doing these travels and sort of beginning to see this story emerge, it was difficult to kind of connect the dots. But I began to see it as a challenge that's that kind of intimate, that climate change is becoming something we can taste, that it's a kitchen table issue in the very literal sense.
So food systems are just extremely vulnerable to climate change, more than any other system, industry, perhaps. And so this is really key to our future. And when this slide first came up, I thought it was Texas. So we're old hat at deep freezes like this. Actually, we're not, and we paid for it dearly a couple of weeks ago. Okay,
yeah, it's a tricky one because like the warmer winters or a milder winter can give way to an early bloom, and so a normal freeze event, let's say in May or April, could have a total kill event. And this was the case at this particular, just a 300-acre apple farm, in Wisconsin. This 28-year-old farmer with little kids, and he had lost his entire crop, more than $1 million in apples in about 4 minutes of a freeze event. And it was just this subtle shift in seasons, this early bloom that then left it open to a great deal of vulnerability. But, we have to think sort of broadly here. 70% of fresh water used by humanity flows to agriculture, right? Climate change is fundamentally a disturbance in hydrology. We'll have too much water in some places, too little water in other places. So any kind of disturbance in water availability is going to have an impact on food producers. But the pressures go far beyond these obvious things like drought or flooding, superstorms, and major heat events. It's also these kind of more unexpected things that are throwing off food producers, like invasive insects, for example, like too much humidity that gives way to a bacterial blight, like weather volatility and swings of temperature, and these shifting seasons, as I said. And what's sort of and discouraging for people like me who love coffee and cacao and, what are specialty crops, flavor rich, nutrient dense crops, that many of these crops are called sort of Goldilocks crops. They like very specific conditions in which to grow. And so any shift, even subtle shifts in conditions, can throw off the production of that crop.
So the vulnerabilities are many, they're varied, constituting an enormous challenge. And what's clear is we just can't keep doing what we've been doing. And your book describes a serious debate between two ways forward for the future of food. But then you actually propose a third way that may be the best. Tell us about that.
So there's a growing controversy about the best way to ensure future food security. And around the time of when I was reading those early IPCC reports, well, not quite early, but 6 years ago, that year, 2014, 2015, Bill Gates proclaimed that food is ripe for reinvention. And it was the beginning of huge flows of investment that have been funding high-tech, what's called climate smart agriculture. At the same time, though, we're hearing sort of a louder and louder cry from sustainable food advocates who would like their food de-invented, thank you very much, who are advocating for a return to pre-industrial, sort of pre-green revolution, organic and biodynamic and regenerative farming practices. And so there's this rift between the reinvention camp and the de-invention camp. And it's existed for decades, but it has become a raging battle. And you have one side coveting the past and the other coveting the future. And from my perspective, I belong to neither side of the debate. I have tried and have not succeeded at becoming a virtuous eater. I am a failed vegan and a very flawed vegetarian and a terrible backyard farmer or gardener. And so here I am watching this debate and wondering, why must it be so binary, right? Why, can't there be a kind of synthesis of these two approaches? Our challenge is really to borrow from the wisdom of the ages and from advanced science to forge a third way, or a synthesis of the traditional approaches to food production and the radically new. And we need to be able to scale harvests while restoring rather than degrading the natural world. And this is the shift to the good news, right? I know I've kind of given you a lot of bad news, but the good news is that there's a lot of scientists and farmers and engineers who are really emulating this third way thinking. They're using modern tools, modern breeding tools like CRISPR to breed nutritious heirloom crops that can withstand new pressures. They're using AI and robotics to help address the overuse of agrochemicals. They're, coming up with alternatives to animal meat and to food waste. And again, I am a consumer of a lot of conventional foods, but I was looking at this as where is the common ground and what are the possibilities here?
Yeah. It's really fascinating what the possibilities are. And in your book, you stress the role that ingenuity and technology are going to play. One example is how you described how you watched the maiden voyage of a weeding robot. How does that play into this third way? Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is one of the early stories that really helped me see this kind of central through line for my research was about this third way approach to food production. And this picture here is Jorge Herod. He's a Peruvian-born engineer who lives in Silicon Valley, and his company, Blue River Technology, invented AI robots. It's called See and Spray. That can weed crops with sniper-like precision. And I went to Arkansas to see this baby robot learn as it moved down this field at 12 miles an hour standard tractor speed. And I have to say that I was kind of half expecting this, these C3PO kind of ambulatory robots with pincer hands come out and start plucking weeds, like as a big group of bipeds. And that is not what I found. I found this tractor with this kind of big white hoop skirt off the back of it. And underneath that is a bank of 24 cameras that use computer vision to see the ground beneath. And then they're deploying with sniper-like precision. Sort of, I know I'm using the pincer thing, but they're deploying these tiny jets of herbicide or concentrated fertilizer to incinerate the baby weeds. So you can see there in the field these little kind of postage stamp looking kind of splots of dyed, that's actually dyed water. It was a trial run. But what's exciting about this is not only that it can eliminate broadcast spraying of herbicides, which is how we apply glyphosate, for example, or Roundup, and reduce the use of those herbicides by up to about 95%. But it really can sort of give way to intelligent machines, a kind of new generation of intelligent machines that can treat plants individually, applying not just herbicides and pesticides and fungicides, but also fertilizers on plants. And so on this, not field by field basis, but on a plant by plant basis, so that larger farms can begin to mimic natural systems, right? Which is a principle of organic and biodynamic and ecosystemic agriculture. And that's so important. Diversity in crops is so important for soil health and for resilience and food systems going forward. And Herod was very interesting, in explaining all this. He said, robots don't have to remove us from nature. They can help us restore it, right? And I began to kind of see Herod as this embodiment of third way thinking.
Fascinating stuff. And another breakthrough in terms of ingenuity and technology you foresee is in the form of vertical farms. So wait, what? Farms are vertical? What's up with that?
Yeah, so increasing crop diversity will be crucial to our food future, to building resilient food systems, restoring soil health, and regenerative farming can play a big role in that, and other traditional farms. It doesn't have to be, AI-enabled farming, but it can help with larger scale improvements in diversity and crop diversity. But equally important will be decentralizing food systems, right? So that when producers in one region are disrupted, others around them can keep growing. And vertical farms can be very important to food production, local and regional food production in regions that are severely drought stressed. The rise of vertical farms, and over here on the left, you see the image of these trays of plants in this indoor facility in Newark, New Jersey, from a company called Aero Farms. This is an aeroponic producer. On the right is Plenty, which does these vertical walls of plants that have hydroponic system. But in either case, you have a pretty significant reduction in water usage. In aeroponic farms, it's about 95% less water than in-field vegetable production. And the plants in both cases grow 30 to 40% faster. So more food can be grown inside the space of a soccer goal than can be grown in the space of a soccer field outdoors. So there's quite a lot of efficiency in these facilities. The problem, of course, is that it's very energy intensive when you're creating the sun indoors. But when located in and near cities, these farms can eliminate trucking and food waste from long distance farms. Most lettuces are currently grown in Salinas, California, and Yuma, Arizona. So, if you're on the East Coast, it's a lot of refrigeration and trucking and rot along the way in the distribution. So it's exciting. It's limited, right? We're not going to be growing, soy and corn most likely in these indoor facilities, but for high nutrient perishable crops, this is a pretty exciting development.
Exciting indeed. Gives one hope for the future. These economies of scale, all really neat. But let's talk about meat. Like yourself, well, even worse than yourself, I'm a failed vegetarian, but I haven't gone all the way back. I've cut way back, but I can't see doing without it. And so is it going to require that we all become vegetarian in order to save our society? Is there any future for meat?
As I said, I grew up in a household where we ate so much red meat that fish and chicken were regarded as vegetable matter. I mean, I just, now I live in Nashville, Tennessee, home of some of the best barbecue in the world. And it has been very hard for me. I have visited slaughterhouses. I have seen, really what the worst of industrial meat production looks like. And it has still been very hard for me to give up meat. So I understand, this notion that we can suddenly convert, 95% of the world of the global population that does consume meat into vegans and vegetarians is far-fetched. We are seeing pretty dramatic improvements in, and certainly adoption of meat alternatives. In the last 50 years, there's been a doubling of human population and a tripling of meat consumption. So the pressures in terms of the climate pressures of meat production are coming not just from population growth, but also from a shift in diet toward more Western protein-centric, meat-centric diets. That's part of why it's becoming important to say, we're not going to eradicate animal meat production, but we do need to think about alternatives as more people come online, as more protein-rich diets come into play, and emerging economies shift toward more and more meat. And I should note very briefly that not all meat consumption is equal when it comes to climate change, right? It takes 6 pounds of feed to make 1 pound of beef. It takes about 3.5 pounds of feed to make a pound of to produce a pound of pork, and it takes about 2 pounds of feed to produce a pound of chicken. The annual output of methane from a cow is equivalent to emissions generated by a car burning 235 gallons of gasoline. It's not, when we talk about meat and climate impact, there's a big difference between, beef and chicken and fish, which is about a 1 pound of feed to a pound of fish produced. So this is, complex, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. But what's important is that these developments in plant-based and alternative meats are pretty exciting, in the sense that consumers who are open to them are really adopting them quickly.
So what are we looking at here?
Yeah, Beyond Meat is the product, is one of the products that is now in 17,000 stores. Impossible Burgers, are in Burger Kings and a whole lot of fast food chains. That's what you see in the lower right, that product in the lower right. But the other category is cell-based meats, and so I reported on this in my book. That I actually consumed a cell-based duck breast harvested fresh from a bioreactor, and it was simmering in that pan in the upper right. And on the left, you see those chicken nuggets are actually laboratory produced chicken. And it sounds terrifying and awful, but it is essentially a sampling of cells, a very small sampling of cells that's taken from a live or recently deceased animal, and given an environment to do what cells naturally do, which is replicate, right? So they're given a solution, a growth solution, like blood or growth solution, that feeds cells nutrients, and they replicate. And the cells are taken from muscle and fat tissues and connective tissues, which is what we consume when we consume meat. And ultimately, on a cellular level, it is no different from animal meat. It is animal meat. It's just grown without the bones and the beaks and the fur and the hooves and the organs and, of course, the sentience of the animal. So we can get into it in a deeper way. But yes, there's a lot of investment and interest in cell-based meats. And the way I got to this story was, in fact, interviewing the then CEO of Tyson Foods, who was investing in Memphis Meats, which is one of the first and most sort of visible cellular agriculture companies. And
So this is
Cardinal Meats and many other major industrial players are beginning to invest in this, and on the grounds that we know that our industry is facing some disruption from alternatives, and we want to, invest in our own disruption, essentially. I mean, again, the point here is not we're going to, immediately or in the next 10, 20, even 50 years, see the end of animal meats. It's that demand for meat is growing. It's very climate intensive, and there will need to be a diversification in the market of other more sustainable ways to produce proteins.
This is pretty mind blowing, and this isn't our future. It's safe for animals, safer for people, safer for the environment if we are going in this direction. But at the end of the day, what did it taste like, Amanda?
I was actually tucking into my plate of bioreactor duck breast. Having signed my life away, there was actually a form that said this is an experimental product and has not been approved by the FDA, and so whatever happens to you is your fault. And I signed it comfortably because the CEO had said his kids had eaten it and he had eaten it. And of course I knew, I mean, on a molecular, cellular level, this was identical to animal meat. And it tasted exactly like meat. It tasted exactly like duck breast because it is duck breast, right? And I know, I haven't eaten a whole lot of duck, but it smelled like duck as it seared. So it was very different than a veggie burger, right? Which, yes, I mean, some of these plant-based alternatives are trying to simulate the taste of meat, but you don't get the same sear, you don't get the same smell, odors when you're cooking it, the same, and the same nutrients. And this is really, again, indistinguishable from animal meats, and so it was pretty amazing. I was vaguely worried that I might start quacking or growing feathers after my meal, but so far that hasn't happened, and it was a few years ago.
So far, so good. Excellent. Wow, this has been fascinating, Amanda. And let's get right to the questions. People have lots of interesting things to say. A quick shout out, Zach saying hi from Albuquerque, Ellie saying hi back from Madison, Wisconsin, and people from even further away. Let's go to our first question. It's from Sarah. It's more of a statement. Climate change is fundamentally a change in hydrology, is an amazing statement. Thank you. So not a question, but a thank you from Sarah. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Can I jump in there? It's thank you so much for that. And I think it's really important to note when we think about the sort of bigger kind of understanding of the relationship between agriculture and climate change. Agriculture is particularly interesting because it is a driver of climate change, and it is also uniquely vulnerable to climate change, right? So it's, probably no other industry or human activity has changed the land use and the flow of water on this planet than agriculture in the last, say, 13,000 years, right? It's such an enormous flow of again, 70% of our fresh water is going to agriculture. So it's so affected by shifts in in natural patterns, having done so much to control them and change them. But unlike the transportation industry and the energy industry, it's very hard to function as a farmer if you are in hostile or volatile conditions. So there's a lot of motivation among ag leaders and farmers and agro-scientists to really try to convert from climate sinner to climate saint. And so it's very interesting. There's a lot of the pace of innovation in this industry is really exciting, and there's a real kind of awareness of the reliance on natural systems.
Right on. Yeah. Thanks, Sarah, for your comment. The next question comes from Paul, is asking, why are farmers against the idea of climate change when they can see the change right in front of them?
That's a really interesting question, Paul, because I actually talked to a number of farmers, including that farmer in Wisconsin who had lost, his entire crop in the span of 4 minutes, about his understanding of climate science. Did he see this as a climate change related problem? And he really said, I am not a politician. I am not a scientist. I'm a farmer. I have I don't know if this is related to climate change, and I don't want to comment on that. And of course, we know that there was overwhelming support from agricultural states for President Trump, who certainly questioned climate science and climate policies at the federal level, and there was almost a hostility toward talking about the pressures on farmers as an issue of climate change, and I think that statement from Andy, who was the farmer that I talked to at length about this in Wisconsin, really said it the best. I'm a farmer. I know that the conditions in which I'm farming are different than the conditions in which my father and grandfather farmed. And again, not all men, but many. And I don't want to comment on this as a scientist or as a politician. And I think that's important. There's a kind of semantic issue. They will tell you the precipitation levels are changing, the rate at which the precipitation is falling is changing. They can't get their machinery into the fields because they're too wet. The volatility and swings from warm to cold is really hurting their crops, but it will not be discussed as a climate issue. And my feeling was, I respect that. Can you just tell me what you're experiencing? And that's how I chose to report it.
Great, thanks. So lots of questions about the vertical farming here. Lots of questions about the sci-fi meat, but let me see if I can encapsulate some of the questions about the vertical farming first together. So Roxanne's asking why they grow faster. Rebecca's are asking, do these crops have a high nutrient value? And I think it was Yuko is saying, how does all about the vertical farming help decrease carbon emissions or otherwise decrease the effects of global climate change, being that it's so energy intensive? So sorry
Let
to
me address that
throw
last.
three together. So pick whichever one you like.
Yeah, they're all great questions. Thank you to everyone, Isabel, Ward, and Yuko. I want to stress, and I talk to any number of skeptics about vertical farming, who would say, including Paul Hawken, the author of Drawdown, who would say this might have this might have a fringe application in a certain region. But I mean, to imply that it is going to help preempt the impacts of that it will reduce carbon emissions is not accurate at this point, because it is so light intensive, right? The notion that we would grow crops indoors with synthetic sunlight seems to be kind of implausible at a time when many people are concerned about too much sun exposure. So the fact is that it actually just insulates the food production from climate volatility. And it does certainly reduce, again, all that refrigerated trucking from faraway regions, and the crop destruction. So Yuma, Arizona, for example, and Salinas have both been impacted by weather volatility. And so, that could disrupt leafy green production, the major kind of epicenters of leafy green production. So these vertical farm facilities could have a kind of safety supply of that kind of perishable high nutrient crop if the major producers in the field are affected, right? So it's not so much will it bring down CO2 emissions, but will it ensure some food security in local regions? Can it improve or maintain the same amount of nutrients? What's interesting is that they're in the AeroFarms facility, for example, there are 150,000 sensors or data points that they're pulling from every harvest. Exactly how much light, blue and red spectrum light these plants need, how much humidity, how much nutrient, how that affects their growth, how that affects phenotype, how that affects flavor, how that affects nutrient levels in the plant. They're learning so much from the process. I mean, it's almost like after when you take the plant out of its natural environment, you actually learn exactly what it needs. I mean, we over fertilize, we overwater all these crops. So there's an amazing efficiency. I mean, I first felt like it was this silent running kind of freaky thing to come in and imagine getting my food from food grown without soil and sun. The more I learned about it, the more I realized that the plants were getting only and exactly what they need. And how amazing it was to really, for the first time really in agricultural history, to be able to measure that and measure the relationship between this amount of light, this amount of nutrient, this amount of humidity, and how that affects phenotype, flavor, nutrition, and so on. But yes, they can certainly get really special flavors and high nutrient levels in the plants. They call it, some of these vertical farmers are calling it post-organic produce, which is a bit controversial, but there you go.
Neat. Great question. So before we end the Q&A, Amanda, we've got to get into the meat of it. So Alexandra is asking, what medium are the meat cell cultures grown on? Alternatively, what do the cells eat in order to grow?
That's a very important question, because what has been controversial is the serum, which is essentially the bath of nutrients, is the liquid filled with nutrients that feeds these cells, and it is derived from a bovine fetal serum, which is of course not vegan, and so there's been a great kind of race to create a vegan serum in which the cell that can nourish the cells so that they can replicate and grow. And that has been, one of the, criticisms and concerns from the, animal cruelty advocate, the Humane Society and other advocates, animal advocates, and understandably, right. On the other hand, though, the notion that you can produce, a critical mass of meat without, any animal slaughter is pretty exciting. So there's overwhelming support from a lot of these organizations for the developments in cellular agriculture. But there's certainly some concern about that exact question, which is, what is that special serum in which these cells can grow, and it is coming. I mean, they're basically saying it's a matter of years, et cetera, to get this vegan solution that can healthily and effectively grow the cells.
Great. So a real quick question, one final quick question, then a quick comment. Final question from Jennifer, and this is set up by your answer you just gave. How sustainable is the animal cell meat? Does the need for animals go down significantly? Do the animals have to die to provide the required cells?
So Uma Valetti is the innovator who taught me about his, work in this area. He is, in fact, an Indian-born MD. He was a cardiologist who worked at the Mayo Clinic, and as he was looking at some treatments for heart patients and heart health, he, learned about what has been going on in the medical industry for decades, which is tissue culture and growing animal tissue culture for medical applications like heart valve replacements and so on. And as someone who had grown up in India eating some meat, not a lot of meat, and had moved to the US and saw the amazing amount of meat consumed in this country relative to other countries, he became a vegan just because he couldn't handle the relationship to meat in American culture. And it was really, and his father was a veterinarian, and he really wanted to ultimately help eliminate the slaughter of the billions and billions of animals a year, and he also wanted a meat product that wasn't fueling so much so many cardiac problems, right? He saw so many patients that were really affected by this. So the upshot is that, yes, could this completely offset animal slaughter? Could this eliminate animal slaughter? I think there are certainly proponents who believe it can. My thinking is that there will still be craft meats, right? I visited many regenerative and managed grazing livestock operations that have very sustainable programs, and some that are claiming to be in now. There's more and more research showing can be carbon negative, right? You can manage livestock farms in a way that the pasture land actually draws down in and locks and sequesters carbon in the soil, and has a great climate benefit. And the animals aerate the soil, and they nourish the soil with manure, and it can be a very sustainable operation, right? And so these are sometimes called craft meat operations. So yes, will we have a future in which it's plant-based, cell-based, and sustainable livestock production? I think that would be a pretty good future.
Excellent. Thanks, Amanda, for all the insight. I'm going to end with just a comment. It comes from Alexandra. Quote, climate sinner to climate saint, end quote, is such an interesting way of putting it. Great talk, and thank you very much. And I think everyone, let's thank Amanda Little for joining us and enlightening us tonight.
Thank you. And can I just mention very briefly that my book, The Fate of Food, this is all research I did for my book, The Fate of Food. It's just come out in paperback, and I would love for you to read it. These are just a few stories from my reporting, and if you have questions, many of them will be answered in this book.
And you can also follow Amanda on Twitter and Insta. So there you go. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you, Jay. It's so great to see you. Happy weekend, and thanks for bringing me into this community.
Great to have you.